Hello and welcome to our channel. Today, we will talk about a horrifying practice that took place in America in the past. A practice that is not only disturbing but also extremely cruel. We are talking about the history of black gator babies. The term black gator babies refers to a particularly gruesome form of exploitation against African Americans prevalent during the years of slavery in America. It involved snatching away newborn slaves from their mothers, selling them off as bait for alligators, or simply throwing them into the water for these large reptiles to prey upon. This abhorrent act was justified by racist attitudes and beliefs held by many white people who believed that black people and children were no different from animals, thus making it acceptable to treat them so cruelly and without mercy. This heinous practice had its roots in plantation economics. White owners saw these helpless infants as nothing more than economic commodities that could be sold off for used as cheap labor when they grew older. However, they soon realized that young babies were unable to do much work and instead began using them as food for alligators instead, a cheap source of entertainment, while providing an added bonus: getting rid of slaves deemed unnecessary or too troublesome. In some cases, plantation owners would even starve the alligators for days before feeding them the black babies, in order to induce higher levels of aggression and excitement amongst the watching crowds. Oftentimes it was done under the guise of religious events, where poor and suspecting families would be tricked into believing their sacrifice would help placate God's wrath. Another example of insidious tactics used against African Americans during this era. Unfortunately, this terrible trade became increasingly popular among slave owners, with estimates suggesting thousands of black children were used as gator bait throughout American history, since it provided an easy way to rid themselves of unwanted extra slaves without having to pay out any money. It wasn't until the early 20th century that this terrible practice was officially made illegal in America due to mounting public pressure put on lawmakers over such morally reprehensible acts being committed against innocent victims. The fact that such atrocities were committed against African Americans simply because of their skin color is a dark stain on America's past, one which still haunts us today as we strive toward true equality and justice for all citizens regardless of race or background. We must never forget those innocent lives who suffered horrific fates at the hands of those seeking pleasure or power through cruelty and brutality towards fellow human beings just because they were different from them. Sadly, the effects of this monstrous practice linger on to this day. There are many stories still being shared by African Americans about the horrible experiences that their ancestors went through as bait children. Many were taken from their mothers at a young age and thrown into alligator pits with no way out, forced to face death on a daily basis in terrifyingly close quarters with reptilian predators. Others were sold off to traders who used them as live bait for hunting or fishing expeditions, where they would often be subjected to brutal mistreatment and abuse. Here are some heartbreaking tales from bait children who lived through these horrific ordeals. An enslaved black boy named Sam was only 4 years old when he was taken away by a trader and sold to alligator hunters. He would spend his days in the swamp, baiting animals with pieces of bacon or small morsels of food while trying hard not to get eaten himself. A young girl named Sarah was just 5 years old when she was snatched away from her mother after being promised some candy. She ended up spending 6 months in an alligator pit until she was finally rescued by a group of abolitionists who found her emaciated and traumatized. Another young girl named Emma was sold into bondage as a bait child at the age of 9. She spent several days in the swamps, being used as bait before finally being rescued by a group of freed slaves. These stories shed light on the traumatic experiences that black gator babies endured during this dark period in American history, and remind us never to forget those who suffered at the hands of such cruel practices. They also serve as an important reminder that we must stand up against any form of injustice, no matter how small, if we are to create a better future for our children. The practice of using black gator babies as bait for alligators was a grave injustice that sparked rage and indignation throughout the nation. As news spread about the cruelty being inflicted upon African Americans, many prominent voices began to speak out against it. One of the most influential figures to do so was Frederick Douglass, an escaped slave who dedicated his life to fighting for freedom and justice for African Americans. In his 1845 autobiography, he wrote passionately about how wrong it was to use innocent babies as bait for alligators. He described in vivid detail the horror of such an act, and called on those in positions of power to do something about it by holding such perpetrators accountable for their actions.